On the day I was supposed to say, "I do," I was left standing completely alone. No father, no family, no support, just me, staring at empty chairs. And I know you're probably thinking, how could anyone go through that? Believe me, I asked myself the same thing. But this isn't just about being abandoned, it's about what that moment taught me, and how it changed the way I see family forever. If you stay with me, I'll take you through every step of that day, and trust me, it's not the ending you expect. The music had just faded, the guests were waiting, and I stood there in my dress, heart pounding, smile trembling, ready for the moment every bride dreams of. But instead of footsteps echoing down the aisle, there was silence. My father's chair was empty. The door stayed shut. And in that instant, I realized I was standing alone on my wedding day. Before that day, my father wasn't just a parent, he was my anchor. I remember being 6 years old, wobbling on a bicycle, terrified I'd fall. He ran beside me, steadying the handlebars, shouting, "You've got this." And when I finally pedaled on my own, his smile was the biggest reward. Those moments built the foundation of what I thought was an unbreakable bond. He was there at every school play, every exam result, every milestone. Back then, I believed he'd never miss a moment that mattered. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. When I won my first debate competition, he clapped louder than anyone else in the room. When I cried after failing a math test, he sat with me, explaining equations until midnight. Those small acts made me believe he'd always stand by me. That's why, years later, when I imagined my wedding day, I couldn't picture it without him walking me down the aisle. But life has a way of rewriting the stories we think are set in stone. Fast forward to the day I got engaged. It was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where family gathered around with smiles and blessings. I remember showing my father the ring, waiting for his reaction. He looked at it, nodded politely, and said, "Congratulations." But there was something missing in his tone, no excitement, no warmth. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. My relatives whispered about whether he approved, and I brushed it off, convincing myself he was just processing it in his own way. But deep down, I felt the distance growing. My cousins cheered, my friends hugged me, but my father just sat quietly. He didn't argue, he didn't fight, he didn't even ask questions. And sometimes, silence is more painful than anger. I told myself he'd come around, that he just needed time. But looking back, that moment was the first crack in the foundation, the first sign that on the day I needed him most, he might not be there. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt like a whirlwind. The venue was booked, a hall draped in roses and fairy lights, every corner glowing with anticipation. My friends helped me pick out the dress, a gown that shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers. The playlist was rehearsed, the seating chart finalized, and every detail seemed to fall into place. Except one. My father hadn't confirmed if he'd walk me down the aisle. Each time I asked, he'd change the subject, or give me a vague, "We'll see." I told myself he was just busy, that he'd show up when it mattered. But that uncertainty lingered, like a shadow behind all the excitement. Relatives fussed over flower arrangements, my bridesmaids laughed as they practiced their walk, and the air was thick with excitement. But every time I looked at that empty spot on the rehearsal aisle, I felt a pang of worry. I brushed it off, convincing myself he wouldn't let me down. After all, this was the day every father dreams of, seeing his child step into a new chapter. Or at least, that's what I believed. The day finally arrived. The hall buzzed with chatter as guests found their seats, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. My bridesmaids adjusted their dresses, the photographer clicked away, and the music swelled, signaling it was time. I stood at the entrance, clutching my bouquet, waiting for my father to take my arm. His chair at the front was still empty, but I told myself he'd walk in any second. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to swing open. Every tick of the clock felt louder, every pause and the music stretched longer. The officiant cleared his throat, the guests turned their heads, and the ceremony was ready to begin, but he still hadn't arrived. At first, I kept telling myself he was just late. maybe traffic, maybe a last-minute delay. But as the minutes dragged on, the truth started to sink in. The officiant looked at me, waiting for a signal. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering, their eyes darting toward the empty chair at the front. My bouquet felt heavier in my hands, my smile stiffened, and the silence around me grew unbearable. That's when it hit me, he wasn't coming. My father had chosen not to be there. And in that moment, the ceremony wasn't just missing a person, it was missing the blessing I thought I couldn't live without. I stared at the door one last time, praying it would open. But it stayed shut. The officiant cleared his throat again, the music faded, and the guests avoided my eyes. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and I realized the moment I had dreamed of my whole life was happening without him. That realization didn't just break my heart, it shattered the picture I had carried of what family was supposed to mean. The moment I realized he wasn't coming, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and my hands trembled around the bouquet. I tried to keep smiling, but inside, panic was spreading like wildfire. My mind raced. Did something happen to him? Did I do something wrong? Was this punishment? Every possible explanation flashed through my head in seconds, but none made sense. The officiant's voice sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. Guests avoided my eyes, and I felt trapped in a spotlight I never asked for. In that instant, I wasn't just a bride, I was a daughter abandoned, standing in front of everyone with nowhere to hide. What I felt in that moment wasn't just emotional, it was physical. My chest hurt, my stomach knotted, and it was as if my body was screaming louder than my mind. And there's a reason for that. Psychologists explain that abandonment triggers the same neural pathways as physical pain. In fact, studies from UCLA show that social rejection activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the exact region that lights up when you stub your toe or break a bone. That's why it felt unbearable. It wasn't just sadness, it was my brain processing rejection as injury. And when that rejection comes from a parent, the impact is magnified. Attachment theory tells us that children build their sense of safety and identity around parental presence. So when that presence disappears, even in adulthood, it shakes the foundation of who you believe you are. The moment the ceremony ended, I couldn't sit with the silence anymore. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed his number. Once. Twice. 10 times. Each call rang out, unanswered. I sent messages, short, desperate ones. Where are you? Please come. But the screen stayed blank, no reply. I asked my relatives if they'd seen him, hoping someone had an explanation. They shook their heads, avoiding my eyes, as if the truth was too heavy to carry. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Every unanswered call felt like another door slamming shut, another confirmation that he had chosen not to be there. I even asked one of my cousins to drive by his house, thinking maybe he'd just lost track of time. But the lights were off, the door locked, no sign of him. It was as if he had erased himself from the day entirely. And with every unanswered call, the reality grew heavier. He wasn't late, he wasn't stuck, he had made a choice. For days after the wedding, I kept searching for answers. I replayed every conversation with my father, every silence, every look, hoping to find a clue I had missed. Finally, the truth surfaced, not through him directly, but through whispers from relatives. He hadn't approved of my choice. He believed I was making a mistake, and instead of standing by me, he chose absence. No confrontation, no explanation, just silence. And that silence was louder than any argument could have been. It wasn't about traffic, or illness, or circumstance, it was about disapproval. And in his mind, not showing up was his way of making a statement. I wanted to believe there was a reason beyond me, that something had stopped him, something out of his control. But the truth was harsher. He had made a choice. He couldn't accept the path I was taking, and instead of speaking to me, he let his absence speak for him. And that hurt more than any words ever could. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what his absence really meant. It wasn't just about me, it was about the weight of family expectations, the traditions we grow up believing are unshakable. In so many cultures, a father walking his child down the aisle isn't just symbolic, it's a public declaration of support, a blessing that says, "I stand with you." Without it, the ceremony feels incomplete, like a story missing its final chapter. And yet, I realized how fragile those traditions can be. One person's silence can unravel years of belief in what family is supposed to represent. It made me question, are these rituals about love, or about control? About celebrating choice, or enforcing conformity? My father's absence wasn't just personal, it was a reflection of a generational gap, a clash between old expectations and new realities. I realized that sometimes, family traditions aren't about love at all, they're about control. They're about saying, "This is how it's always been done, even if it doesn't fit the world we live in today." And when someone refuses to show up, it forces you to see those traditions for what they are: fragile, conditional, and often more about appearances than support. That realization changed the way I look at family, not as a guarantee, but as a choice. In the weeks after the wedding, the silence felt heavier than the day itself. I woke up every morning with the same question echoing in my head: why wasn't I enough for him to show up? At first, I tried to bury it, pretend it didn't matter, distract myself with work, with friends, with anything that kept me from thinking. But grief has a way of finding you in the quiet moments. That's when I realized I couldn't outrun it, I had to face it. I started journaling, pouring every thought onto paper. And strangely, it helped. Research shows that expressive writing lowers stress hormones and helps people process trauma. Each page became a release, a way to untangle the chaos in my mind. I also leaned on therapy, where I learned that abandonment isn't a reflection of my worth, it's a reflection of someone else's limitations. Slowly, I built new routines: morning walks, meditation, surrounding myself with people who did show up. Healing wasn't instant, but it was possible. And every small step reminded me that I wasn't defined by who left, I was defined by how I chose to move forward. I realized healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about rewriting the story. Instead of focusing on who didn't show up, I started focusing on who did. Friends who checked in, mentors who listened, even strangers who reminded me that kindness exists. And with every step, I learned that abandonment doesn't define you, it challenges you to define yourself. With time, I realized that my father's absence didn't have to define me, it could reshape me. At first, I carried the weight of that day like a scar, replaying the empty aisle over and over. But slowly, I began to see it differently. Family, I learned, isn't just about blood, it's about presence. It's about the people who choose to stand beside you when life feels unbearable. My friends who stayed late after the ceremony, my partner who held me when I broke down, even strangers who offered kindness, they became the proof that love doesn't always come from where you expect it. And in that realization, I found strength. I stopped waiting for apologies that might never come, and instead, I started building a life rooted in the people who showed up. That day didn't break me, it taught me that sometimes, the greatest power comes from standing alone and still choosing to move forward. I used to think that being left alone on my wedding day was the worst thing that could happen. But now, I see it as the moment that forced me to grow. It showed me who truly cared, who truly stood by me, and it reminded me that love isn't about tradition, it's about choice. And I chose to keep going. If you've ever felt abandoned, if you've ever stood in a moment where the people you thought would be there simply weren't, you're not alone. My story is just one version of a pain so many quietly carry. And that's why I wanted to share it, not to dwell on the hurt, but to remind you that healing is possible, and strength can be found even in silence. I'd love to hear your story too. Drop it in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not the only ones walking through this. And if this journey resonated with you, hit subscribe, because together, we're building a space where no one has to feel left behind. This isn't just my story, it's ours. Because abandonment, heartbreak, and healing are things so many of us face, even if we don't talk about them. So let's talk. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your lessons. And if you want more stories that don't shy away from the hard truths, but also remind you of the strength you carry, make sure you subscribe. We're building something bigger than just a channel, we're building a community.